Welcome, everyone. Jordan Burton here, joined by my colleague, Matt Walsh.
Nice to meet you all.
We're excited to get this started today. I'd like to set the tone for this program that we'll go through here today by asking you guys a couple of questions, two questions. The first question is, as you think about the role that you play, your job, what you're trying to accomplish, the mission of your organization, and how your role connects to it, how important is your ability to accurately assess talent? How important is your ability to figure out, for a candidate you may be looking to hire, somebody you may be looking to back if you're an investor, how important is your ability to accurately assess talent? And let's use a 1 to 10 scale. 10 is like, it's the single most important thing I have to do. 1 is the worst. Like 1 is like not important at all. Second question, how confident are you in your ability to do that? How confident are you that you can accurately assess talent when you have the opportunity to ask somebody some questions? Keep those numbers in your mind. We're going to come back to them because we've asked these questions of a lot of people, thousands of people, in fact. We're going to show you some interesting insights. All right, quick introduction. There's some familiar names here. Some of you may know who we are. A lot of you don't. My name's Jordan Burton. Quick background on me so you know where this sort of all comes from. 17 years ago, I made a significant left turn in my career. I entered the world of executive assessment. I joined a firm that basically had an approach to assessing CEOs and senior executive talent. It's a firm called GH Smart, fabulous company that sort of a leading player in this market today. And I did a lot of this, did a lot of interviewing. Never thought that would be the career I would be doing, but I actually ended up doing a lot. After about 6-7 years there, I ended up on my own, still doing a lot of interviewing, but my real passion was teaching other people how to interview. Just always loved doing that and figured there was a pretty good business opportunity in doing this, especially being in the Bay Area, being around a lot of high growth organizations, companies that were craving some sort of an approach that would help them get better information about candidates, deliver a better candidate experience, essentially fill their teams with top talent. It's been a crazy journey, a whole lot of clients along the way. One of them that I actually worked very deeply with around the 2015 era was a company called Palantir Technologies. Was sort of deeply embedded in interview training at that company. And that's where I met Matt. I'll let Matt introduce himself from there.
Hey, everyone. Matt, nice to meet you. A former lawyer, took a career pivot into technology as a sort of product manager at Palantir. While there, about 1 year in, I got really into interviewing. Came across one of Jordan's trainings, absolutely loved the methodology, actually moved to London for the better portion of a year, training up all the interviewers there, working with external recruiting agencies, basically seeing the start to finish talent pipeline from start to finish at a high growth technology company. Once I left in 2018, started partnering with Jordan. Love interviewing, love teaching, super excited to share some counterintuitive insights with you all today on what questions you should and should not ask candidates.
All right. So what are we here to do today? We're going to talk about one aspect of interviewing. It's the one that we hear a lot of questions about. A lot of people think it's the biggest part of the story. I'd say there's a lot more to interviewing than just interview questions, but it's certainly a hot topic on people's minds. So we're going to kind of geek out on it. We're going to talk about what makes a great question, what makes a bad question, some different ways to frame it up in your minds to where you can judge for yourself. Am I asking good questions in interviews? We're also excited to talk about basically the next chapter in our organization's history. We changed our name, became Talgo a few years back, the talent algorithm, and we've continued to serve more and more clients, from investors to high growth technology companies to companies outside of technology. It's gotten very big, and we're looking for opportunities to reach a bigger audience. We have created Talgo On Demand, and it's an exciting sort of hybrid product service that we'll close with. Make sure that you have an opportunity to go deeper on this and really learn the tools and strategies. With that said, let's go back to our two questions. How important is this, and how confident are you in your ability to do it? So, like I said, we've asked this question of thousands of individuals, senior executives, investors, talent professionals. Here's where the data plays out. CEOs, CXOs, heads of functions, all corporate hiring managers, VC investors, private equity investors, VCPE talent professionals, and recruiters or search professionals, people whose job really is sourcing great talent. What's interesting, there's some conversions here. A little over 9 out of 10 on average. That's huge. Try to think of something that people would say, this is over a 9 out of 10 on average in terms of the importance to my role. In terms of the confidence that I have, it varies by population, with our recruiters and search professionals feeling the most confident, and our VC investors, interestingly, feeling the least confident in your ability to accurately assess talent. The gap is huge, and I would challenge you to think of another business process, another skill that has such a high importance and where people generally don't feel that confident. It's our reason for doing what we do, and we thought this would be a fun sort of comparison base with a very large data set that we've amassed over the years. All right. Before we get into the questions part of this, I'd like to have Matt just share a little bit about what's the point of an interview? Why do we interview at all? And what really is our objective when we do?
As we go through this content, I know this is a webinar. I would still love for it to be as interactive as possible. Please feel free, put questions into the Q&A button that you have at the bottom of your screen. We're going to be answering those both via text, responding in line, as well as live during the webinar. All right. With that said, what is the point of an interview? One of our strongest held beliefs is that the average interviewer is treating the interview as a sort of performance. And as a result, they're not getting what they should really be caring about, which is the truth, real truth from the candidate. So think about why that would happen. One thing that can happen, one job that you have as an interviewer, is to help really find what's true about the candidate's past experiences. What you often get during an interview, if you're not careful, is this performance filtered, biased, spun version that comes out of the candidate's mouth for a host of reasons. It could be that you didn't ask a good question. It could be the candidate's nervous. It could be the candidate really wants the job. There are so many things that can take away what could be pure signal, could be the actual truth that you want, and instead you get a managed reality, shall we say. So one job that you can think of is a great interviewer helps the candidate help themselves in a way, gets past all of these packaged, spun stories, and just gets to the real truth inside of their brain. So that's sort of like the negative version, right? How do we get past the BS? How do we get past the spin that I think a lot of people have just accepted job interviews are inevitably full of this. And we've almost just learned to tolerate it. We're going to show you how to get past that. But there's also a second job. This is a really sort of a higher calling, if you will, as a great interviewer. How can I get to stories that are true that the candidate did not have easy access to? We don't all have just 100% perfect memories where we have instant recall to every single relevant story. Some are more easily accessible. Some are more buried, shall we say. We're going to show you some different tools and lenses to think about how to excavate those memories and get candidates sharing stories with you that they will not be sharing with other interviewers and other companies because they're simply not conducting the interview as well.
All right, if that's the purpose of an interview, let's zoom the lens out. We're going to show where questions fit into it. Questions aren't the whole story. They're an important part of the story. It all starts with the setup. If you want to be able to accurately assess talent, they need to be expecting that kind of a conversation. Seems silly, seems obvious. We see so many mistakes at this step, especially in the land of talent acquisition professionals who are trying to learn about a person's capabilities, skills, motivations, all of that, but they haven't set a dynamic where that is essentially where the person is consented to share that information. So a lot of our curriculum, a lot of what we share on Talgo On Demand is about how to get people comfortable, excited even about sharing of themselves, setting the stage for what is effectively an interview. Secondly, this could be the most important part of the whole deal. Questions would be way up there, but there will be a future webinar on this for sure. Rapport, connecting with the human being from a place of curiosity and fascination. Essentially, we want to have this magnet in front of us that pulls from the candidate in a way that they want to share information about themselves. And that is the power of rapport. There's so many ways to build it. There's so many ways to break it. Again, this would be something that we are very passionate about, teaching folks all the ways to manage rapport and use it in the course of an interview. Then there's questions. Only thing I would say on this one, and it kind of is our framework for how we'll talk about it today, is that there's essentially two kinds of questions. There's initial questions that start a line of inquiry. It's basically what you might have 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 initial questions on your list when you meet with a candidate. That's the starting point of a conversation. The follow-ups are all of the magic, all of the drilling down and getting the details, regardless of the question type or question format. Then there's time management, which is very much the art, and I would say one of the most underappreciated skills in great interviewing. If anyone has ever been in a situation, think about it in your own interviewing past, where you've had candidates, you're 15, 20 minutes into the interview and you're still on the first question, one of two things happened. Either you didn't set expectations, and this candidate has, maybe they're nervous, maybe they're droning on and on. Maybe you are digging too deep in the story and trying to squeeze too much out of it, or perhaps you just need to jump in there and move on to the next one. So
I would say
90%
of the people that we coach need to learn to jump in. Not the topic of today's webinar, but something to keep in mind for the future.
And we actually have some fun clips in Talgo On Demand of us actually executing these interruptions, these sort of very polite ways of getting in through fascination and curiosity to keep us moving. And then finally, you can do everything right, and you either didn't capture the data or you didn't use the data properly. So a big part of our approach, our methodology, our training is knowing what to do, how to capture the data and how to use it. Questions so far, because from this point, we're going to zoom in on questions. So if there's things that fall outside of interview questions, feel free to pop them in. And thanks to those of you who submitted questions in advance. How to cut people off while maintaining the impression that you're curious and interested in their stories. What a fabulous one. So imagine you're talking and you're talking. I'm nodding. I'm going to actually do a couple of vocalizations. Huh. Yeah, interesting. Something that just registers my voice in there. If I'm nodding and smiling and engaging while I do it, the interruption is not like the interruption in a political debate where I'm trying to overpower you or tell you you're wrong. That kind of interruption you feel. But if I go, so what ended up happening? What was the net result? If I do it from a place of like, I can't wait to hear what you have to say next, you won't even know that I interrupted you. Truly, you won't even know that it happened. We get into a place, into a flow when someone is showing us curiosity, where interruptions actually look like kindness. It looks like somebody is so passionate about what we have to say that comes out. Wonderful question. We have a couple techniques that we show in Talgo On Demand, like very specific tactical ways to signal that you want to get in. One, if they're looking at you, and one, if they're not looking at you. Ways to artfully get in there. All right. Keep those questions coming. We have some questions that were seeded in advance that we'll make sure, Matt, if there's any on there that look like they're context appropriate, we can jump them in. All right. This is a kind of a hot off the press, fun bit of IP we've put together. Anytime you're asking a question of a candidate, you have a goal in mind. There are some good goals of questions, and there are some bad, counterproductive goals of questions. I'll have Matt start off by just walking through what we see as 4 good, worthwhile, noble goals of an interview question.
Number 1, we want to make sure that the candidate actually has the drive and the passion to do this job well. We also, of course, want to make sure that they are skilled and have the relevant competencies that will enable them to succeed. We also want historic evidence that they've generally been a high performer in previous roles. We all know those people that actually have theoretically the skills and talent to succeed, but for whatever reason, they're sort of consistently mediocre performers in their actual jobs. It's quite predictive of their future performance. And lastly, we want to make sure that their style and that their values are aligned with your company. This is not a lazy culture fit. Oh, you look like me and sound like me, I just hire my friends. No, but we all know those people that have the ability to be high performers and do great work, but their modality, the way in which they work, the way in which they interact with others, either on our team or with clients or whoever it is, doesn't mesh with our working style. They're not a good fit for our culture's organization. So these are 4 critical things to make sure we are getting really clear signal on during the interview. And now Jordan's going to talk about things that a lot of people are implicitly optimizing for with their questions that are not quite as good as these top 4 boxes.
And by the way, if you would like to defend any one of these next 4, please let us know. We're happy to, I'll give you a little bit of color context, but there's reasons why we think these are not great goals of an interview question. First would be, if your goal is how well the candidate prepared for the interview, you might say, hey, that actually tells me something. I do care that they prepared it. I want to know that they've looked into us, they've learned about us. I would ask you, why does that matter? Well, it shows that they're legitimately interested. It shows that this is something that they're passionate about. It shows me that they're diligent. It shows me that they know how to prep. That's number 1. And number 2, they're motivated to do the job and they have the skills to do the research. That's what you're actually after. Be careful of the candidate prepared well for the interview, especially when you start going after passive candidates. Passive candidates have day jobs. They're not actively looking. They're not going to have as much time to prepare, especially earlier in your process. You're going to be overly impressed by those who are actively looking, may not have many options, and you might be less impressed by the ones who are passive and don't have as much time to prepare. Candidates who speak well, candidates who are persuasive on the fly. This is one of the biggest traps we see. You ask a question that you think is going after one of the 4 good things, but really what you're testing is this person good at extemporaneous speech? We're going to look at some actual questions that fall into that trap. This is another huge trap, probably the biggest enemy of great hiring: bias. The candidates like me, or I like this candidate. This can happen no matter the question. We got to be very careful that the data that we're capturing, the data that we're focused on, is objective. It's what the candidate's sharing and not just the impressions and the affinity that we feel for a candidate. It's a major threat to DEI hiring in particular. Finally, candidate gives me confidence. Regardless of whether I like them, I just want to hear the candidate say things that give me a feeling like they're going to do well. So there's some questions that are optimized. People think are optimized for other things, but really they're a test of, can this person make me just give me the touchy-feelies that this is going to be a great fit? Any questions on these 8 goals, the 4 good ones and the 4 not so good ones? Because we're about to use this framework to evaluate a whole lot of questions. Does I like the candidate make more sense if you are, for example, hiring a co-founder? That's an interesting one. If you have an experience with a candidate where it is obvious there is a personality mismatch, especially in a small organization, especially one where you're going to be working very, very closely with this person, that I think is legitimate. If you have an aversion to something about this person, that's likely to play out. The biggest problem we see is the reverse of that. I like this person, therefore I'm going to project that they have all these other qualities. They're like me, therefore they must also be incredibly driven and comfortable with uncertainty, and insert other things that you value. So it's a little bit of like, don't completely ignore those points around intuition, but just understand when they're on the positive side, it can lead to bad hires.
We have a great question on how do you assess, related question, how do you assess culture fit? It's sort of a multi-part answer, because part 1 is getting really, really clear on what you mean by culture fit. That goes into building a target, sort of outside the scope of today's webinar, but definitely a core part of the content that we cover. The really short version is to be very, very specific about what is needed at your company for someone to work effectively with others. And you really try and force yourself to not just rely on these sort of cliche adjectives that everyone is using to define what their culture is. Good communicator, team player. You got to go a layer deeper than that to get really crisp about what you're looking for. And then once you have that foundation in place, a lot of the advice we're giving today on the ideal questions to ask will make a lot more sense. We should also mention one more implicit assumption we're making in all of this, because I think some of you may be looking at boxes at the bottom 5, 6, 7, 8, and you're like, well, what's so wrong with that? Something that me and Jordan are doing and that we would encourage everyone to do is when you are conducting these interviews, take good notes. The interview is going to be a data collection exercise, an enjoyable one the candidate's going to love with high rapport, but we're collecting great data. That gives us an advantage. It means we don't have to judge the candidate in real time. We don't have to rely on our subjective, biased, noisy interpretations in real time. We're just going to gather a ton of great data and then make a really intelligent hiring decisions after the interview is over. It's going to increase your hiring accuracy by a lot. And we talk about this a lot in the Talgo On Demand course.
By the way, Brianna asked a great follow-up question on the culture point. How do you coach people to assess real culture fit versus whether I like this person? Matt's thing around codifying the culture is the key. Let's have a set of things that define our culture that uniquely speak to who we are, and not just to anyone who's like us, but really things that stand out. Perhaps we're a culture in which feedback is free-flowing and very direct. Some might feel it's even harsh, but it's a big part of who we are and how we operate. That's something very distinct, and we can train people how to find evidence of that. We don't want someone to come back and say, I think they're a good cultural fit, without putting that in the context of specifically codified items, a short list of items that say who we really are, who we've all decided we really are.
And we'd love to see evidence from their past. I'd love to see real data that you gathered during the interview, real data, real examples that speak to these points, rather than just your subjective experience of how they performed with you during the interview, which is what a lot of interviewers are optimizing for. Oh, in this 45-minute interaction, I felt this emotion. And that's the one-to-one mapping they use to make the hiring decision, rather than real stories that actually happened in the past that speak to these important cultural competencies.
All right, let's have some fun. We're going to use this framework, and we're going to throw a whole lot of questions up here. All right. You have an intent when you ask a question. You have a goal in mind. And it may even be one of the ones on the top, one of the green ones that we like. But there's an effective goal, what you're actually getting. Sometimes those are different. Let's take, I think it's the most common interview question asked ever, period. Some version of this question, I think, is the most commonly asked interview question. Why are you interested in this job? Or versions of that. Why do we ask this question? We're going for this. We want to make sure the candidate is motivated to do this job. What are we really getting? We might get a little bit, but we're getting an answer to a question that the candidate prepared for. They knew this was coming. They have your website. They probably have something like a job description that tells what you're looking for. So this is an area where a person is going to give you a little spiel. And that tells you how well they prepared for the interview. Is there ever a time to ask this? Sure. There's a select period of time. We do talk about that in our training of when it's okay to ask this. You want to make sure you have the right momentum going into that question. There's better ways to ask this one. There's better ways to get a candidate's motivation alignment. Let's look at another question. I'd say this is one of the most common questions asked of CEOs and C-level execs in interviews. Board members love this one. Investors love this one. What would you do in your first X days here? Often 90 days, especially if you're an impatient like private equity investor. What would you do in your first 2 weeks here? What are you going for when you ask this question? I want to know that they have the skills and competencies to do it. And I want to know that the way that they're going to do it, when they tell me what their first 90 days look like, I want to make sure that that's aligned with this organization. Because if they come in and they're breaking glass, it's going to be organ rejection. Something like that. Noble intent. What are they really getting? We've looked at a lot of answers to these questions. We've seen a lot of notes from investors and others. And what we find is that you're really getting how well the candidate prepared for the interview. You also are looking for largely does the answer give me confidence that this is the right person? Does what I hear sound like I can imagine them on stage leading this organization and making everybody excited and aligned and productive? There may be other things here too. Now, I will say if somebody gives you a terrible answer to their first 90 days, you probably have gotten some good signal on skills and competencies. If they say that the way that they're going to do the first 90 days is totally misaligned with your values, you actually did get some signal on that. Just be careful of the good answer. This is a hypothetical question, and those can be very, very deceptive. That's a subject we go deep on in the training. All right. Yes. We have a question on, is there a better way to ask this? Yeah, there's all sorts of things you can learn about. I would say the best way to do this is to learn about where a person's been and what they've actually done. Learn about their first 90 days in a lot of different organizations. If you're talking about senior executive candidates, most of them are going to have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, perhaps, roles that they come into. Learn about those early periods. There's a whole set of questions to unpack those, of course, to make sure you get the real signal and not the spun story. There are magic questions floating out there. We pay attention to these blogs that go out where people say, hey, I've got my one killer interview question. There was actually First Round Capital put up a really interesting blog that had 40, what they called like the 40 best interview questions that they had amassed from this really incredible list of entrepreneurs, investors, whatnot. Some of them were fabulous. We were big fans of. We use them, in fact. Some of them were not so great. Here's one that we've seen frequently. It's just one of these kind of like, I like to catch them off guard. Tell me about a time you felt strongly about something and then you completely changed your mind about it. This is one of those kind of magic question-y things. You're typically going for largely values alignment, that this person is somebody who is willing to admit that they were wrong, that they're open-minded, that they're able to use data to validate or invalidate things, and that they're able to shift and pivot when they find out they were wrong. That's largely it. There may be some other intents, but what you're really getting is, are they like me? Do I kind of like them? Are the things that they change their mind about things that I think they should have changed their mind about, or do we agree on this? And really, a lot of magic questions are about spontaneous production of stuff out of somebody's mouth. Can this person on the fly come up with, weave a tale that we get really excited about? Be careful of this question.
And to make that point more clear, the reason why that's the case is there is an implicit contract that we all seem to have signed up for, where when an interviewer asks a candidate a question, it's not really acceptable to say, I don't know, or I can't think of one. That's almost viewed as like a de facto failure of the interview by almost everyone. So as a result, when you ask a question like this, that someone might not have easy access to, they're not simply going to be honest and tell you, I don't know, nothing comes to mind. They're going to start BSing. On the fly, they will start BSing you. It's a survival strategy. Like, that is what's going to happen. And as a result, you're going to start getting a lot of data that's not really the data you want.
Well, let's take another magic question. How would you redesign our product if you could? What's your intent on this one? It's probably that they have the skills and competencies. I want to see that they think about product the way that we would want to, that they're somebody who can really diagnose what's working and what's not and see opportunities, that they have this innovative potential competency that we really care about. What you often get is candidate prep. Once again, they've learned a lot about your product. They may have just spent some time anticipating something like this, and also this spontaneous generation of information. This is one I would say is mixed. In some situations, we have some companies that say, we ask this question, we actually do get interesting replies. Just be careful with it, because there is noise. There's a high ratio of noise to signal in this one. How about some good magic questions? Are there single questions that we think are actually really interesting ones? One of the ones that we saw in this first round blog that we liked, what's something you're really good at but never want to do anymore? You know what? Pretty good way. If a candidate is telling you what they're not motivated to do, and I would take them at their word for that. If they're really good at it, you can also dig in and find out how good they are at it. What's interesting is these things that people are really good at but don't want to do anymore, you need to understand that if that's a big part of the job, they're not going to be motivated to do it. That's a concern. In addition, please understand that, like, they probably, if they're competent at it, they actually probably can mentor people. So if there's people on their team that need to do this thing, if it's something around coding, if it's something around Excel modeling or something like that that they no longer want to do, but they're highly competent at, they could be a good judge of quality. So we might learn some things. Not a terrible magic question. Here's another one.
As we go through these, if people are feeling brave, you can be anonymous if you're not feeling brave. Please, in the Q&A, post your favorite question, and we can respond to some of these live.
All right, here's one other magic question that was from this this blog, this First Rounds blog. What's a misconception your coworkers have about you? It's interesting. We like this one so much we use it a lot. What it really is telling you is a couple things. If you unpack it the right way with follow-ups, it's not just, let me throw this question out and hear your answer and hooray, but what you really want to learn about, what is the misconception? Perhaps who holds it most strongly and why? It requires the person to, when you explain the gap, you're talking about what's my inner truth and what's the perception of me. It involves self-awareness, and knowing who holds that and why they hold it involves others' awareness. There's a degree of empathy. There's a degree of knowing how other people. So if self-awareness and empathy are important skills or important competencies, traits, values, it's a very interesting question to ask that. So we don't want to say all magic questions are bad. It's just the ones that are grounded in the fundamentals of effective goals that are good. This sort of green top row. You can put just about any question up here and value and do it based upon that. All right, two more kinds of questions that I just want to make sure we talk about the perils of. The mouthful. The tell me about a time when, and it has a whole bunch of stuff, a bunch of qualifiers. Tell me about a time when you had a really tight deadline, you had a cross-functional team, you needed to get something done, and you had significant opposition from somebody. That's 3 filters that you're putting on the candidate's response. Either they're going to do what Matt said, which was BS you, make up a story. Even good people who are not frequently liars are going to feel weird saying, got nothing, so they'll probably fabricate one. Or they're going to take some second-rate, not particularly interesting story. Yeah, there was this one time that was kind of like that. And you're going to waste time learning about a story that wasn't particularly noteworthy. So don't overload your questions. And generally speaking, we would call this kind of a heat-seeking missile question. I have this very clear vision of what the role is. And I'm essentially going to say, tell me about a time when you did everything on this job description. So that I can be lazy and I can just sit back and let you tell me how good you are for this job. We say simplify the questions. The burden is on you to navigate to the stories that are relevant and move past the ones that are not, as opposed to asking the candidate, hey, can you walk me to something that sounds like my job description?
And collect great data while you're conducting the interview so that you don't have to try and judge whether or not they're the right person for the job during the interview. That's an implicit reason why people ask these questions. They're hoping it's the one perfect question that if they can just get a great answer on the fly, they can feel confident, yes, this person is the right fit. And that's simply not how it works.
Indeed. And finally, one of my least favorite interview questions, and one of the absolute most common. Tell me about yourself. This is what you do when you don't have a plan at all. This is unstructured interviewing. There's all sorts of research you can look up that will tell you how bad unstructured interviewing is. Your intent is noble. It's any one of these things. I just want them to start talking, and I'm going to figure out if they're passionate, if they've got the right competencies. Maybe they'll touch on how they performed. Maybe they'll talk about the kinds of values they hold deep. What you're really getting is a whole lot of noise. This is a recipe for, let me sit back and formed judgments based upon how you look, how you sound, how crisp and articulate you are, how nicely you package your story. So enough said. Please blow that one up. Why would we do something like that? Well, that often happens when we don't feel like we have license to ask real questions. We're just meeting somebody. So maybe we should just say, tell me about yourself. I would say, let's let them know that we have a set of questions that we want to run through and ask them real questions where we can get real data and not make it a performance. Okay. We're going to depart from this framework. We'll talk a little bit more about initial questions and then follow-ups. But before we leave this fun framework, questions about questions. By the way, on the point of these 4 high-quality questions, what are good questions? What's a good strategy for getting these 4 things? This is where we go super deep in our trainings. This is a big part of what is in Talgo On Demand. It's a big part for those of you who've been through our trainings. I think there's a few on here that certainly have, you'll know what some of this is. We'll give you some general guidance on passions and motivations and drive. We like open-ended questions about actual choices that they've made, both academic ones and professional ones. Learn about the big forks in the road and why they took the fork that they did. Dig into those in detail. That tends to be what they're really passionate about, as opposed to their made-up story as to why this role is their dream job. Candidate having the competencies and skills, wow. There's a million strategies here. We generally like open-ended, what we call side door questions. We'll talk about that in a moment, about the key positive and negative events in their past. It's not just positive and negative events. There's other access points we can use to get there. But largely, we like to hear stories about things that actually happened, things that are true, things that are not spin or hype or projection or extemporaneous speeches. Track record of performance, so many ways to get after it. One that we'll throw out is letting a candidate know that there's a reference process and asking what we're likely to hear in those. Getting third-party perspectives in advance of actually doing the references is a very powerful way to learn about overall performance. Many, many other strategies for this one. We love that strategy. Candidate style and values, alignment with the org. This often comes from the stories themselves, the nuances, how they did what they did, the steps they took, the actions they took or did not take. This can be stories about great things that happened, or it could be about failures and mistakes. Again, there's so many ways to go after candidates' values and alignment. That's just sort of a general strategy for questions. Is look at the details, the follow-ups around the questions that you're asking, especially for number 2, kind of these positive and negative events. Matt, anything to add on this one?
I would just invite people to submit their favorite questions. Be brave. Post your favorite interview question in the Q&A. We will be gentle and fair in walking through.
And anonymous is an option too.
And anonymous is always an option as well. Yes.
All right. Matt talked about getting the truth versus the truth-ish. How do we reduce spin? A few strategies on this. Whenever you can, structure your interview to kind of go chronologically. What's interesting is that human beings store facts in episodic memory, largely episodically, largely in a narrative form. The way candidates prep for interviews is by coming up with a set of stories, because they're expecting you to say, tell me about a time when. Tell me about a time when you showed great leadership. Tell me about a time when you, tell me. So they have this sort of optimized for subject, optimized for content arrangement of data in their head. That's where the canned stories live, is in this database that's tagged by the content you're going to go after. When you go chronology, they got to start telling their story, and the story has to add up. And when we're telling a story that proceeds through time, we tend to just go with what actually happened, more so than we do when we're able to just put our little canned speeches together. I talked about side door. This is essentially not broadcasting what you're looking for. Get me to a story without telling me what you're looking for in the story. We have a really exciting sort of submodule in our program where we go deep on side door questions and show you examples of like, what's a pretty good question, but that's a little bit too obvious what you're looking for, and what's a couple of different ways to rephrase that same question to be more side door. Get to a specific story. This is a huge failure mode of a lot of interviewers. They're so proud that they're talking about the past, but they say things like, how have you typically sold big deals to a sales executive? What's sort of your usual approach to managing team accountability? When you say typical and usually, I, as the candidate, can BS you like crazy. I can tell you a completely fictitious, made up thing that never happened that sounds great. What we want to do is talk about a specific team, a specific deal. If I tell you about a bunch of deals I'm proud of, don't ask me how I did a bunch of deals. Say, which one are you most proud of? Let's go deep on that deal that you sold in that quarter. That's where the facts lie. And we've kind of hinted at this before, but anytime you can ground, if there's eyewitnesses, stakeholders, people who cared about this person's performance, grounded in that. There's all sorts of techniques for how you weave that into the story to make sure that that adds the truth element to it, that there's a potential follow-up with people that were also there.
And just to explain the logic behind getting to a specific story, not only are you far more likely to hear actual truth and data and specifics, people in general don't want to lie. Your average person, once we exclude the low single digit sociopaths from the population, your typical person does not want to lie. It feels very physiologically and psychologically uncomfortable. The more high level and general your question, the more spinning in performance someone can do without feeling like they're lying. Once you get to the specifics, there's a very clear choice. You can tell the truth or you can lie. And the vast majority of people are going to tell you the truth. There's also a nice thing where you get someone's 3 best stories on a particular topic or example. You'll notice that a lot of candidates, the story sounded great at the top layer. And once you actually dug in, and we're going to talk about follow-ups here in a moment, you end up realizing, wow, those weren't all that impressive. But if you just stayed high level, you would never know. Once you start getting to the specifics, this becomes more obvious. Jordan, we had someone brave. An anonymous attendee asked, what are your strengths and areas for development? Not you, Jordan. I think they're saying, this is one of my favorite questions to ask.
Am I being interviewed?
What? Yeah, exactly. What do we think about that?
Getting at strengths and weaknesses?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. I think you can ask people for their strengths and weaknesses. The trick is grounding that in reality, because anyone can make up anything. I could say I have these fabulous strengths that I don't actually have. So the important part, and what a great segue to our discussion of follow-up questions, by the way, is to ground those in tangible examples and get a few, especially if it's a really important strength that's really material to the role. I want to get enthusiastic about learning about that strength in action and seeing just how big of a deal that story actually was. I would also say there's a lot of different ways to phrase strengths and weaknesses. You're going to get it in Talgo on Demand. We have a table of like 8 to 10 different ways to ask for strengths. And I know there's at least 8 different ways to ask weaknesses to where we don't sound like an interrogator. What's another weakness? What's another weakness? What's another weakness? All sorts of creative ways of asking essentially the same information and doing it in a way that sounds more spontaneous, organic, and delivers a better candidate experience. All right. Hidden truth. That was the other, remember the thought bubble behind our little icon? How do we get the stories that maybe they're not telling other companies? There's a few strategies here. Chronology works really well. When you go chronologically, people say things like, oh, I haven't thought about this, but we also did this whole new version 2 of such and such. And it was only by proceeding through time that they accessed this story, the non-prepared story, because we had them tell their story in chronological order. Also, when you ask for something that's relevant, like tell me about a big innovation that you drove there. If you go one story deep, you're probably in canned response territory. Go ahead and get that one, but get a second, get a third, especially if it's somebody who's like in a product role. Innovation's obviously a big part of where they've been and what they've done for years. I'd get a lot of stories about innovation. Get past the canned ones. Make sure it's appropriate. What's another is a great way to do it. What's a fourth big mistake in that role? Starts to be a little We either want to rephrase it, use different terminology. Again, one of these 8 ways. We have 8 ways to ask for mistakes too. Use multiple access points. We think about this in terms of events, what happened or didn't happen, attributes, strengths, weaknesses, grounded in events, and third-party perspectives. What X person or what Y person is likely to say. Why does this generate stories that the candidate would not have otherwise shared? You can ask a candidate for 5 big successes in their time at XYZ company. And they will exhaust all of their memories of these 5 stories. And then you say, tell me about your review that you got, your final review. What was on there as a big positive? Oh, I totally forgot to mention, I got this special assignment. That's what we would call an access point. As soon as you introduce the third-party perspective, their synapses fire in a different way. And boom, you've got a story that they didn't share otherwise. Finally, perhaps the single most important way to get a whole lot of data, to uncover hidden truths, to have everyone on your hiring team be a specialist. Don't have 8 people asking the same set of questions over and over again and comparing versions of the same 5 canned stories. Let's look at the role and divide and conquer. You go deep on these aspects, like kind of interpersonal change management. I'll go deep on technical skills and marketing, because that's kind of my background. Somebody else will go deep on certain aspects of our values and cultural alignment. Avoid duplication of questions, then avoid duplication of stories. All right. A little quick break point here. Matt has a couple things to share. Still got a whole lot of attendees on here.
We're now going to transition. Again, please keep posting questions and we'll answer them. We're now going to move into the world of follow-up questions. Regardless of how good your initial question is, let's just say you followed all of the advice we just gave. 90% of the great data you're going to actually be using to make the hiring decision, it's not going to come from the first layer. It's going to come 2, 3, 4, 5 layers deep into the story. So we want to think intelligently about what types of follow-up questions should we ask. But even before going to that, what's sort of our goal? What do we actually care about getting to in a story? And how do we want to be connected to the candidate? We have an entire, very lengthy module on how to have great rapport with the candidate, which is going to unlock a lot of this. But fundamentally, I want to know, my 3-part checklist is, what did the candidate do? What did they truly do? Not just what did the team do, because those are different things. What did they do? How did they do it? I'd like to know in some level of detail how they unlocked that result, because that helps me map it more granularly to whether or not it will or won't apply to my company's setting in this new role. And I also want to know how big of a deal it was. I want to be able to calibrate it. I want to be able to know, how did it compare to either the boss's expectation, the client, the peers, the industry. Context matters here, right? Don't just sort of take someone at their first high-level description of it being such a big deal. Dig in. With all that in mind, notice what we didn't talk about. We didn't talk about how confident was I in their response. We didn't talk about how interested was I in this particular story. This is something I was guilty of as a new interviewer. You get someone talking about something that interests you, it's very easy to start going on a 10, 15-minute complete tangent, and you're no longer doing your job as an interviewer. We're trying to get that sweet spot ratio of a great amount of relevant, real, valuable information in a short period of time so that we can collect a lot of these stories. And that way we don't over-index on any one story in particular when it comes time to make the hiring decision. So now we're going to go through some very common but bad follow-up questions. We're going to talk about why they're bad. Post in the Q&A if any of these sound wrong and if you want to try and defend them. Okay, the first one. It sounds like this project was a success. Is that right? It is very easy to fall into a habit of phrasing things in a leading manner, sort of showing your hand. And also notice that, is that right? It's a closed-ended question. So it's directive, it's closed-ended, and you're clearly chasing a hypothesis. The candidate feels that. It's not going to elicit great, true data. Next, was she mad when you gave her that feedback? Again, another closed-ended question. Right? There's a sort of a hypothesis there. The candidate may feel judged. Let's think about a better way of phrasing that one. Instead of, was she mad when you gave her that feedback? How about, how did she respond? For almost every closed, see, the problem is not that you're internally curious. That's great. You may have your internal curiosity trained to the right spot. We see this with investors all the time. When we do interview coaching for investors, they're typically very sharp. Their nose for value is dialed in, but the way in which they are expressing the question telegraphs what they're thinking and judging, which is a problem for a lot of reasons. And it sort of makes the candidate feel judged, and often closed-ended questions have an implicit right answer. This is a good litmus test for any follow-up question. If there is a right answer to your question, what do you think you're doing to the candidate's response? You are biasing it massively towards the thing you're hoping to hear, which kind of defeats the point of asking the question in the first place. Next, let's say someone is telling you about their proudest analytical accomplishment. That is why we are on this story. It's for Jordan to brag about his best analytical accomplishment, but he mentions that he presented it to the board. And I'm like, oh, presentation skills are actually another thing I really care about. A very common mistake here is to start going down the rabbit hole, to start chasing this tangent about presentation skills. Now, why is that a bad idea? Why don't we just get a 2-for-1 special? Hey, he already mentioned it. Let's just hear about presentation skills. It's because the presentation skills was not the reason Jordan mentioned the story. I didn't say, give me your best example of presenting to such and such audience. It's entirely possible that the presentation portion of the story isn't particularly noteworthy. So what's going to happen is the candidate's going to feel obliged to play along and answer you, but you may be hearing this sort of ho-hum, very average story when you could be spending your time on sort of a 2 or 3 sigma, really high magnitude story instead. Stay focused on what brought you to the story. Another one we see a lot, another common mistake. The candidate finally gets vulnerable and shares a real mistake with you. And you're tempted to ask, how did you fix it? Or how have you improved since then? I know those are 2 different ones. They're the 2 most common things. It's very, very common to want to ask this question. Why do we not want to ask, how did you fix it? It's because what if the candidate didn't fix it? Not all mistakes get fixed. And what are we implying? What type of judgment are we implying when we ask that question? We're really saying, on some level, it actually wasn't okay that you made this mistake. So show me how you fixed it. And now in the future, when I ask you for additional mistakes, you're only going to share mistakes with me. We've put the filter back up. You're only going to share mistakes with me that you've actually fixed. So a lot of these things are subtle. The question seems totally harmless, but it's actually injecting a little bit of judgment that didn't need to be there. Instead, just hear about their mistake, hear about it in detail, ask great follow-up questions, show up with the same positive energy and non-judgment that you were using on the positive accomplishments, and the candidate's going to actually just open up and just share. People love sharing when someone's curious and non-judgmental. And then we judge the data afterwards. That's the key, not during. And this last one's kind of subtle. Pretend I'm on a story about how I did this really impressive software project. This actually happened to me recently in a mock coaching, which is why this brought up. So how much did user adoption improve? Now, it's not a bad question per se, but it's only appropriate if the interviewer already knows that that's the key metric. The problem in this interview was the interview was just going on their own hunch that that's the metric they thought should be most important, but it wasn't the most important one in my story. So the candidate feels a little bit misheard. The question kind of comes out of left field when you could instead be asking things like, what was the client happiest with here? What most impressed your boss on this project? See, you don't have to guess at the key calibration metric. You can often use these third-party, more general, non-directive questions to hear the story, and it actually gets you much better data overall.
All right. Just real quick on follow-ups. As Matt mentioned, we're trying to get to a single story from the past, ideally tapping into this candidate's real memory versus a performance or generalities. The map we like to use, what did they do? How did they do it? How big of a deal it was. This really is kind of a very rough blueprint. We go through in much more detail about specific questions you can ask that get at each one of these different components. But we're really going after those 3 things. And again, staying relevant to what brought us to this story. Keep it very simple. We want these follow-ups to be short, simple, open-ended, non-leading, and not chasing a hypothesis. Matt, you want to close us on this, and we'll talk briefly about Talgo on Demand?
Yes. So you're going to notice, and this is something we deal with 90+% of our coaching clients end up going through a period where they're asking a pretty good question, but they're not asking it simply enough. It's like the nugget of a good question is there, and then they feel the need to add a preamble, or then they need to start sharing an example of when they did the thing. There's a sort of learned confidence from knowing that you're asking the right question, that you know you can ask it simply, and that you know that you have the power to ask great follow-up questions to where you don't need to overly complicate your questions. So let's take a look at some good ones. Tell me more about that. What happened next? What was the net result? What was the hardest part there? What was your specific role? How did the client respond? How did that compare to her expectations? What would your boss say was most impressive? A great world-class assessor is in there quite often. We are not just sitting back, letting people monologue for 3 to 5 minutes. That is frankly not a good experience for anyone. And it's not going to get you the best ratio of data per unit of time. So we're in there quite frequently, but the questions are short. By the way, it's easier to sneak in a short question than a long one. And also, you just don't need long, complicated questions. The more you add to it, the more you tax the candidate's brain, and the more filters you add in, the more you are optimizing for this sort of hyper specificity, and the less you are going to get real high magnitude stories that actually happened, which again is the entire point of the interview.
Thanks so much for joining us on this. We want to tell you one last point, this Talgo on Demand that we've hinted at throughout this. What is this program? We heard a lot of feedback over the years as we've kind of grown and grown with our clients as they've grown. We've heard, hey, we love the training. Hard to get everyone lined up at the same time to do it live with you. We want to see things in action. Can we watch you actually do it? We get a ton of impact from live experiences, live practice, as opposed to just us pushing content. We want something that scales with the company. When we add new people, we don't always have like critical mass to do another full-on training. How do we take onesie twosies and get people trained up as part of their onboarding? This is what we've put together. There's an anytime, anywhere curriculum. Micro-learning, little pieces. It's Matt and I. We got high quality production of us walking through all these principles and all the details that we sort of glossed over today. Very digestible. It's a lot of fun to go through. There's videos of us actually doing interviews or coaching some of our clients doing interviews, showcasing the techniques that we talk about. We can actually see it. That's something we can't even do in a live training unless we do a sort of mock one, a demo.
With our annotation of what's happening at why and why it works as you're watching the technique.
Live learning. So we pair this. It's not enough to just do this anytime, anywhere, like absorb the content. We want to have muscle memory built. We want people actually trying this, doing this, learning this. So we offer monthly live learnings. We're going to have some Q&A where people can come in. They've taken the curriculum. They want to ask questions about it. Great. And then we will pair up and practice. Pair up with other individuals, do mock interviews. Matt and I help guide and coach as you go along. It is an incredibly powerful way to learn fast. The single fastest way, interview us. We do a lot of one-on-one coaching where we can play the part of a talkative candidate, a shy candidate who only spins and only tells the positive. Or if you're at a more basic level, we can be easy on you, but we basically give you a chance to be in a gym, kind of your punching bag to try out your skills at all these techniques. If you're a big organization, we offer enterprise licenses on this. We let us know if you're interested in that. You can swap in and out users. So you just basically anyone in your organization with your email can access it, and it can grow with you as you grow. The bundles that we offer, the interviewer, the core interviewing package, plus live learning for 3 months. The manager is the full curriculum, whole lot of other content, plus live learnings for 6 months. And the founder is awesome. This is where you get sort of the full curriculum, 12 months access, and we're going to give you 3 one-on-one coaching sessions with Matt and I. That's where you get the accelerated skill development. Enterprise licensing, just reach out to us. Jordan at talgo.io, Matt at talgo.io. Or if you just would like to access one of these right now, you are kind of in the club's not open yet, and we're letting a few people in. Email us if you're interested in this. Give you a discount on it. Going live next week. We can stay on if there's any remaining questions. We still have a significant chunk of folks on. If there's anything we didn't get to, please let us know. There was a question around pre-screening psychological assessments. You know what? Generally speaking, we don't find it to be super data rich. You're comparing to an overall tool or metric with tens of thousands of others. It doesn't tell you specifically. I think it can be a good adjunct. I would not make it a primary thing that you're leaning on. It can be useful for exactly what you said when someone is kind of being deceptive about who they are in interviews. The psychological assessment can shine light on that. Just be careful of saying that that is my be-all end-all source of data to learn about this person's psychology. We would say interviewing's even better when it's done well. Advice on coaching other hiring managers that came through email. Yes, coach them. All sorts of ways.
It could be a good point to talk about our train the trainer approach that we do with some of our clients, because that would be the way that they get trained up often.
Chief people officers, head of talent at an investor, we will often work deeply with them, get them at a super high skill level. Now you're self-sustaining. That person can essentially train, observe, coach anyone in the organization. It's probably our favorite way to really have sustaining impact in an organization.
Thank you to everyone for your time. We really appreciate this, and we're looking forward to working with you all in the future. Take care.